Welcome back to PJ Takes 5. Today is Friday, July 25th, and the New York Jets are still cursed. But we start today by looking at holdouts across the NFL, beginning in the nation's capital with Terry McLaurin. The star receiver is away from the team right now as he enters the final year of a 3-year, $68 million contract extension he signed a few years back. Looking for a long-term deal, McLaurin has reason to look for some long-term security. He's just coming off his 5th straight season with 1,000-plus receiving yards and put up 13 touchdowns last year. In context, he had 14 receiving touchdowns in the 3 previous seasons combined. Definitely one of the biggest receiving threats in the league and a great, reliable target for Jaden Daniels in his young career. With Jaden Daniels on a rookie scale contract entering year 2, it makes a lot of sense to take some of that extra money you're not spending on the quarterback position and put it into a top receiver who's kind of that security blanket option for him. I think this will get ironed out at some point, hopefully not before too long here. If McLaurin and Daniels are around and healthy for week 1, it'll be the first time in his career that McLaurin's had the same passer going into a season 2 seasons in a row. So definitely a big priority and a need to get him re-signed and get the offense back with one of the most important players on that unit and get them hitting the ground running heading into the season here. McLaurin's, like I said, one of the best receivers in the NFL. I don't think he's looking necessarily to get paid like a Shemar Chase, kind of reset the top of the market, but definitely needs a new deal and should have some long-term security just in case anything were to happen before the end of the season or in the middle of the season. Yeah, at age 30, which he'll turn in September, still in his prime, but on the back end of that prime. So wants to get one more big bite at the apple, so to speak, and that makes a lot of sense. Heading a little bit northwest of the nation's capital up to Cincinnati, there's now 2 big defensive end holdouts for the Bengals there. The Shemar Stewart situation has been pretty well documented by this show, especially the 17th overall pick has yet to sign his rookie deal. He's still the only first-round pick from last April's draft to remain unsigned. Him and his representation demanding some change in verbiage regarding the guaranteed money in his contract. But then star defensive end Trey Hendrickson joined the holdout list for the Bengals. Another player set to turn 31 this season, so still in his prime. Just had a great season last year. Led the league with 17.5 sacks. I don't think anybody else had more than 14. So definitely kind of put his mark on the season despite the Bengals defense in general struggling throughout the year. Hendrickson is set to earn just $15.8 million next season, which I know just $15.8 million sounds crazy. That's a lot of money, but for somebody who's arguably the most productive defensive end in the NFL right now, that's definitely a bargain. So after the signing of Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase and T. Higgins this offseason, it makes sense for one of the NFL's best defensive players and pass rushers to look for a little more money and a little more long-term security. One of the big hang-ups is that he's looking for guaranteed money past just next season, and that's been something that the Bengals historically haven't really been willing to do, is offer guaranteed money into long-term deals. They did so with Jamar Chase, which kind of marked a change in thought process there, but definitely a case for Trey Hendrickson there. Like I said, one of the best pass rushers in the NFL and really came on moving from the Saints to the Bengals a couple years back, and he has a good case to try to be earning a little more, so he's going to remain in Jacksonville, Florida until he can get a deal done with the Bengals and return to practice. Then a few players who aren't necessarily holding out but are still in the mix to get new deals. Micah Parsons, like Hendrickson, another great defensive end. A little bit younger, at age 26, so kind of ramping up into that prime that we were talking about, but it was well documented on Monday that owner and de facto GM Jerry Jones had some inflammatory comments about Parsons, basically said that he missed time and that there's no guarantee that you're going to get a player for the full season just because you re-sign him. So Parsons, to his credit, is playing. He's currently set to play under the 5th-year option, which is about $24 million. So definitely not starving there, but a really great player who the Cowboys should be pretty eager to get signed long-term. Since entering the league in 2021, Parsons has the 5th most sacks behind only Myles Garrett, TJ Watt, Trey Hendrickson, and Nick Bosa. Hendrickson we just talked about, but Garrett and TJ Watt both signed for north of $40 million a year this past offseason, so it makes sense for Parsons to try to eclipse that number, get up to the 41, 42, 43, maybe even 44, 45 number. And then James Cook up in Buffalo, a really great young running back who has really come on the last few seasons. His numbers maybe aren't as statistically dominant as some of the other great rushers in the NFL, but you have to remember that he's playing with Josh Allen, who won MVP last year. So not only does the offense pass the ball a lot, but the quarterback run is also a big part of that unit, especially kind of in the goal line area. So it makes sense that some of his touchdowns have been cultured the past couple of seasons, but Over the past 2 years combined, Cook put up 2,800 total yards and 24 total touchdowns. So the production's there. And then the postseason last year, in the 3 playoff games that the Bills played, he averaged 100 yards and 1 touchdown in each game. So definitely a big part, of that rushing attack as the season kind of turns to winter and into playoff football. Jenkins, an interior lineman for the Packers, he's making that switch from guard to center this year. About to turn 30, so like we said with Hendrickson and McLaurin, just trying to get another bite at the apple. Is currently under contract, so isn't going to hold out necessarily, but just wants to make sure he gets some more guaranteed money going forward, and he's kind of has some long-term security. They just signed Zach Tom to a 4-year deal a week or 2 ago, and then they signed Aaron Banks as a guard in free agency, so they're ironing out that unit, and Jenkins is looking to get some long-term security, especially as he moves to a different position there. And with the Niners, Juwan Jennings, receiver, looking for a long-term deal. He's on the last year of his deal, about $7.5 million this season, but the Niners have really gone through some receiving problems. Brandon Ayuk's hurt, and there's really no timetable for his return. They traded away Deebo Samuel this offseason to Washington, and then Ricky Pearsall, their first-round pick a couple years back, is currently hurt, is set to return this weekend potentially, but Jennings coming off a career year where he had 77 receptions, 975 yards, and 6 touchdowns, all of which were career best for him. So crucial part of that Niners offense, and there's a lot of the gritty run blocking from the receiver position that you want to see in those outside zone schemes. So another player who's not sitting out but is looking to get long-term security from the team. And then the last player here that we're going to talk about, Courtland Sutton with the Broncos, had a really big resurgent year last year, first 1,000-yard season since 2019. Another player who is practicing, isn't necessarily holding out, but is in the final year of his contract and is set to make about $13.5 million. So again, just trying to make sure there's some long-term security. The Broncos are in that youth movement with Bo Nix there, and they have a couple of receivers, Troy Franklin, Pele, and Sutton, understandably, kind of just wants to make sure that his spot moving forward is secured. And then moving on down here, we got some Bears topics. I'm a big Bears fan, so we're going to make sure we talk about them as the season gets closer here. Heading into training camp, their big position battle is at the left tackle spot. So the big note so far, it looks like Darnell Wright is going to stick at that right tackle spot, which I love. I think he just has that kind of body type, kind of like Penei Sewell, where a little thicker, a little wider, a little stronger. It really makes sense to have him on that right side, anchor that run game out there, protect the edge. In today's NFL, there's really no difference from a left end versus a right end. They can both scream off the edge, but I like keeping Wright at that right spot, not just for the obvious pun there, but he's got manimal player who I think is going to really hold down that right side. So then on the left, it's between Braxton Jones, who is the incumbent starter, Kieran Namagaji, who's a second-year player, rookie Ozzie Trapillo, all of whom are battling for that left tackle spot. Jones has been one of the number ones for install period, but still coming off that fractured fibula from last December. He isn't quite ready for team reps, so far that's been Amagaji for the starters when it's kind of more full speed. We'll see, how they kind of mix people in and out. I know Ben Johnson was saying that it's pretty unique to have a 3-person race for that number 1 spot, but that's where they are right now, and I'm sure as games get played, that depth chart will kind of iron itself out. And, I think Braxton Jones is a really valuable player. I kind of look at him like a Charles Leno from years past, where could you do better than him? Sure, but I think you could do a lot worse. And just having somebody on that left side that you're comfortable with and you're confident in, I think that's super important. So if either Amagaji or Trapillo ends up winning that left tackle spot, I think Jones could become a very interesting trade piece down the line as another team's left tackle gets hurt in training camp, or for whatever reason a team needs a left tackle, obviously a super valuable position, and even though he's in the last year of his deal, would make sense for some team to voice some interest in him, even if he isn't their starter. Then going down to the rookie tight end, Colston Loveland, cleared to play finally following an AC joint injury. So he got hurt last September with the Michigan Wolverines and played through it for pretty much the entire season, and then got surgery in January. So heading into the draft process, this was something that every team knew about and was comfortable with, and obviously the Bears were comfortable with enough to draft him in the top of the first round. He was limited and it wasn't super physical in mini camps and OTAs, but it looks like he's full go here for training camp. So that's a good sign. They're going to get him back pretty soon and kind of integrate into the offense quickly and get him into those 12 personnel looks and playing out the slot, kind of that power slot position. I think he's going to be a big part of this offense and just a big kind of security blanket target for Caleb Williams. I always think for a young quarterback, having a big, physical, over the middle of the field target that if everything goes wrong, you can kind of target. Just know that as long as you get it around his radius, he should make a play on the ball. I think that's super important. So glad that he'll have that kind of receiving threat to lean on. A lot of stuff about Ben Johnson so far, being that kind of detail-oriented freak that he was called has apparently removed the starting offense from a team period twice now already. So that's kind of a good sign. I like him to be that super detail-oriented, and if you're not getting something right, he's going to tell you about it, and maybe not particularly nice about it. But it's good to see him kind of putting his fingerprints on that offense. Obviously, he's a genius, but having that kind of change in disposition from the previous staff, who was a little more laid back, I think is going to be a good thing for an offense that has a lot of younger pieces at the skill position, and then kind of some older veterans on the offensive line who can kind of help these players along a little bit. But like to see Johnson bring that energy and mentality to the offense. And then on the defensive side, different Johnson, Jalen Johnson has been hurt. He's on that non-football injury list, which Ian Wheeler and Jedi Walker were on until recently they got elevated. But Jalen Johnson, it looks like he's set to miss a couple of weeks here. Has some sort of leg injury. Doesn't seem to be a long-term thing, but like I said, he's going to miss a few weeks of practice. So one of the best cornerbacks in the NFL. You still trust that he's able to do what he can do without a lot of practice, but switching into a new defense with Dennis Allen, which shouldn't be too different from the cornerback spot. But it was still nice to get him out there kind of within his teammates and just get him kind of in the fold. It is a good opportunity for other defensive backs, specifically Tyreek Stevenson and Terrell Smith, to get more reps as they're kind of soft competing for that cornerback 2 spot. Kyler Gordon has that slot position pretty secure, and Jalen Johnson is secure in his cornerback 1 spot, but trying to figure out that cornerback 2, I think it'll end up being Stevenson. Obviously, he has that, very famous mishap on the Hail Mary, and that kind of derailed the Bears season, but his season last year as well. And getting him all the reps he can have and comfortable in this new defense is probably a good thing. Going to another rookie here, Luther Burden, who was a 2nd-round pick, listed as day-to-day with a hamstring injury, has yet to play throughout training camp. Got banged up a couple times through the spring during mini camps and OTAs. Looks like they're going to get him back pretty soon here, but again, like Loveland and even Johnson, new coaches, new offense to learn. It'd be good to get the reps in. Obviously, he's a super explosive athlete. I know there's a lot of talk about him being a really big kind of boomer bust prospect for the Bears, but I think he'll be good kind of in that slot. Just get the ball in his hands and let him go to work and try to take some shots here or there. But really, I think he can be a special player with the ball in his hands, kind of over the middle, similar to Loveland, where kind of a security blanket of, if the blitz is coming, you got him on a crosser, just dump it down and let him do something with it. But would like to see him get involved here and start learning the offense so that he can be ready to go to impact on week 1 there. And then the running back position, it seemed like they were trying to target running backs throughout the draft, going from maybe Ashton Genty as a top pick, maybe Travion Henderson in the 2nd round somewhere. They ended up picking up Kyle Monangai from Rutgers in the 7th round. And I know he had a big play the other day, ripped off a long run on Thursday. And he'll be part of the offense in some capacity. But they still got DeAndre Swift, they still got Roschon Johnson, who are kind of more downhill, powerful runners, who should both benefit from having an increase in talent in the offensive line, especially in the interior there, running behind Thuney and Jonah Jackson and Drew Dahlman. I think will improve their production and opportunities a lot. But as we know, in the Ben Johnson offense, running the ball seems to be pretty important. I know he talked about having a goal for Caleb Williams to get 70% completion, and being able to complete the ball and pass the ball effectively leans so heavily on your ability to run the ball effectively. And if you can get the defense respecting that rushing attack, everything in the passing game kind of opens up. So I assume that even though the Bears kind of lack that superstar running back name, they'll still be pretty dedicated to running the ball. And then back on the defensive side, they signed defensive end Tano Passingway, 6'7", 290-pound defensive end, drafted by the Chiefs when Poles was in KC, and then played recently with the Saints when Dennis Allen was there. So just kind of that big frame defensive end that it seems like this team is really looking for. Fits the billing, can kind of play some inside-outside versatility, but good against the run, can pass rush a little bit. We'll see how he works into that defensive end rotation. Obviously, they have Montez Sweat, Austin Booker, I know. They are working in. as he's coming up. I know he kind of quote unquote redshirted last year just because he was so young. So we'll see where the newcomer kind of fits into that rotation, but can hopefully make some sort of presence felt. Moving down to another Chicago team, getting away from football for a second with the Cubs. So they just lost their series versus the Kansas City Royals 2-1. Lost on the aggregate score 14-20. Obviously that 20 is a big number and a little concerning, and it's even more concerning when you think about in a 3-game series they had one shutout and still allowed 20 runs. So in that game 3 deciding match, Colin Ray allowed 3 homers in 5 innings pitched, and then Drew Pomeranz came in and allowed a home run as well. And then the first game that they also lost, Ben Brown, in his first game back after being called up, gave up 2 homers in 4 innings pitched. And then Chris Flexen also gave up 2 home runs in 3 innings pitched. So not great against the long ball there. Got to have a little better execution, which we'll talk about here, the options for that. But the Cubs are such a good offensive team with the power hitting and the base running and getting on base in general that they just need a little more from the pitching group. Obviously, the defense is great as well. So if they can get a little more consistency from the pitching, that would be amazing. And that Royals series loss was their first home loss since late June, about 2022, versus the Mariners, who came in and won a 2-1 series as well. So the Cubs are set to face the White Sox this weekend, starting today, Friday, Saturday, technically on the road, but obviously a crosstown series. So the Sox aren't maybe the rollover team that they're billed as right now. They've won 5 out of their 6 since the break, including a sweep of the Pirates. I know the Pirates also maybe aren't the best team in baseball or anywhere close, but still an impressive start for the White Sox coming off the break. And then the Cubs will have a quick turnaround from that Sunday to a road trip starting Monday against the Brewers, which will be super important. The Cubs are currently 1 game back from the Brewers for the NL, the NL Central, and the MLB record lead. So if they can pick out a couple games there and even that up or overtake them, obviously that'll be a big move. And maybe even more important than the games right now is the impending trade deadline coming up on next Thursday, so a little less than a week away. Kind of got started off last night. The Mariners traded for first baseman Josh Naylor from the Arizona Diamondbacks. The Diamondbacks got 2 pitching prospects back in return. This kind of signals that the Diamondbacks might be kind of open for business. I know pitching-wise, Zach Allen and Merrill Kelly are both kind of rumored to be out there and could help out the Cubs for that 3rd starting pitcher role behind Boyd and Shota. But then the Diamondbacks also kind of floating out Eugenio Suarez, the 3rd baseman. He's had 36 homers, which is the 4th most in the MLB. He's in the final year of his deal, but definitely the Cubs wanted to go all in on the offensive side of the ball. You would maybe think about him and just add like another big bat. I'm kind of more on the side right now of stick with Matt Shaw, who's really showed some promise here and has come on, had a couple of big homers since the break. Definitely a cheaper option, definitely a more prospective option, kind of hoping that his best ball is still in front of him offensively. But I just don't know if you want to be giving up what would likely be a package of Shaw and maybe Owen Casey or some prospect to get a guy who might end up being a rental, especially when you still have to pay Kyle Tucker, PCA kind of looming as well. So looking at the pitchers, which I think is a little more likely for somebody that the Cubs could go after. They just saw him, Seth Lugo from the Royals, could make sense. He had 2 earned runs in 6 innings pitched in that 8-4 win against the Cubs to win the series there. But some other arms, Dylan Cease, who's with the Padres, was a White Sox for a couple years there. He's also an impending free agent kind of guy, so you have to be a little careful with that, but he can make some sense as another starter. And like I said, those 2 D-backs, Gallen and Kelly, make a lot of sense. So I assume that the Cubs will at some point add somebody. I would hope that would be a pitcher, and they won't have to give up anybody. I know there's an article floating around somewhere that they would have to give up Seiya to get Cease, and I would say that's probably not worth it. Obviously, you can't get a guy for nothing, but I would look to maybe... I would like to ideally retain the big starters. PCA, Kyle Tucker obviously aren't going anywhere. Michael Busch not going anywhere. I'd like to keep Matt Shaw. I'm a believer. I'd like to keep Nico. I'd like to keep Dansby. So I guess the only real starter you could look at would be Ian Happ. Maybe try and move him for a pitcher and then bring Casey up. That could make some sense to me, but I just think they're so good right now, and you know, they're looking for something just to take them over the edge, but you don't want to blow everything up and get rid of a person who is actually pretty integral to the whole defense and the hitting side of it. So we'll see what happens. Like I said, a little less than a week away, so maybe even by the time I come back to you guys on Tuesday, they will have made a move. Moving on down the list here to a player who used to be in Chicago, Justin Fields. Like I said at the top of the show here, it seems like the New York Jets are still cursed, and try as they might, they really can't get God on their side at all. So Fields went down with an injury on Thursday morning. He was carted off. Initially went to the tent on his own ability, hobbled and hopped to the tent, but then was carted off to the locker room, and it seems like he dislocated his toe. I just saw that it was actually his pointer toe, so the one next to his big toe on his right foot. So nothing that should hamper him long term. They marked him as day-to-day. But he is obviously a big part. He signed that 2-year, $40 million contract to come in as a starter. He's kind of the de facto starter with the rest of that room. Tyrod Taylor, Adrian Martinez, Brady Cook. I don't think the Jets are really interested in having any of those guys considered as their starter for the year. I know Tyrod obviously has some experience at 35 years old and has played for, I think, 14 teams now. But you know, they're pretty pot committed to Justin Fields. And that first week, they're set to face the Steelers. So obviously, the kind of revenge game for Fields, but then also the revenge game for Aaron Rodgers, who signed with the Steelers. So I'm sure not just for the narrative, but for the actual on-field football, they want to get Fields back for that game. I like the spot that Fields is in this year. Not that this is the biggest thing ever, but he doesn't have a huge price tag, so that kind of pressure of having to be like an MVP caliber quarterback isn't necessarily there. But the Jets have done a lot of good stuff in roster construction, reuniting with Garrett Wilson, who was Fields' receiver at Ohio State. And the two are pretty prolific there. And then you kind of round out that group with Mason Taylor, who they just drafted this year, Josh Reynolds and Alan Lazard, who are both, you know, experienced enough receivers, and then Malachi Corley, who's, you know, kind of like Burden. We were talking about, just a receiver that can do a lot with the ball in his hands. And then from the running back room, to complement him in that rushing game, you got Breece Hall and Braylon Allen, which is a nice combo of Hall being that, you know, speedster, catch you out the backfield, kind of bounce it and go, and then Braylon Allen being that real downhill, you know, maybe some read option where he's going downhill and then Fields can pull it and go around the end. But a lot of rushing options in that backfield. And then the O-line, really, they've done a lot of good work up there. Going left to right, we got Olu Fashanu, John Simpson, Joe Tippmann, Elijah Vera-Tucker, and Armand Membu. So the tackles are both first-round picks. You know, Membu last year and Fashanu the year before that. Elijah Vera-Tucker, a first-rounder. He's been there for a couple of years and has some good positional versatility. Tippmann is a second-rounder a couple of years back, and then Simpson, a former fourth-round pick, really the only guy that isn't like a homegrown, highly drafted player. So they've definitely put the investment in up front. I know they had Tyron Smith last year. That's kind of their veteran left tackle who kind of showed the way for Fashanu, and I'm sure other guys in that room a little bit. But they've done some good work to get a big, physical, talented offensive line in front of Fields, which, as we know with the Bears, he never really had that luxury. So I think we could see a player that we hadn't seen either in Chicago or in Pittsburgh, somebody who can get it done on the ground and maybe through the air. Obviously, staying healthy will be important. The Aaron Rodgers saga a couple years ago is well documented. Getting hurt on the first drive of the season for the Jets, so as long as Fields can kind of avoid that curse, I'm looking at potentially a career resurgent year. And then one more player, Christian Wilkins, kind of in an interesting spot. Last night it was announced that the Raiders were actually going to release Wilkins, which came as a surprise. They signed him just last offseason to a 4-year, $110 million contract, and they're releasing him now. Basically, they're terminating him as a vested veteran, which basically means that they had an injury concern with him, and specifically they were concerned that he wasn't doing everything in his power to recover from an injury. So Wilkins suffered a Jones fracture in his left foot about 5 games in, and then didn't return. He had surgery to fix it, but then kind of balked at getting a second surgery there. And so the team released him and was able to void the remaining $35 million guaranteed back on June 4th, citing a failure to maintain physical condition. So yesterday, Thursday, was the last day for Wilkins and the NFLPA to file a grievance, which they did. But again, we mentioned this last episode talking about the NFLPA leadership problems and why it was important. And it's exactly for situations like this. You know, you have a player who's in an odd situation who could use the association's help, and they're kind of nowhere to be found. I'm sure somebody is helping him out, but you know, this is why this is such a big story, because as we get into camp and people start playing physical football, we find situations where people get hurt and people have grievances and want to claim these grievances and go to court if they need to, file a lawsuit if they need to, and to have so much dysfunction at the top of the NFLPA doesn't make that a lot easier. So hopefully everything that's going on this summer with that group doesn't affect Wilkins' situation. It's a little unclear where he is in terms of his timeline. It doesn't look like he has like a real firm timeline. But I would push back to say that he has any real injury concerns long term. He played 17 out of 17 games each of the 3 seasons before joining the Raiders, and pretty successful. 17 sacks in the past 3 seasons combined, with the Dolphins there, including 9 in 2023. So 17 sacks over 3 seasons might not sound like a big number, but for an interior defensive lineman, that's pretty good production, especially when you think about that he's demanding double teams in the run game and in the pass game. So definitely a player who has a high ceiling and can help out a team when healthy. Again, no clear timeline on when he's going to return, but you think if he could get healthy at some point before too long in the season here, either before the season or during the season potentially, he could help a lot of teams out there. Having a violent defensive tackle that requires double teams and extra, you know, blocking and kind of scheme correction is super valuable. So it could make sense, you know, if the 49ers are finding themselves at 4-2 and they say, well, we could use one more player and Christian Wilkins is healthy there, that would make a lot of sense. I don't think there's a lot of teams that would say no to that necessarily. So just kind of have to see how healthy he is, what the price tag is going to end up being, all of that. But part of an interesting free agency group last year, headlined by co-players Kirk Cousins, who obviously went to Atlanta and is kind of the backup now and could potentially be on the move. Tyron Smith, we talked about earlier, was a big free agent for the Jets, but currently isn't on a team. C.J. Gardner-Johnson, the safety, went to the Eagles, returned there, and he's already left. He's with the Texans now. Jonah Jackson went to the Rams, is a big deal, and has now got traded to the Bears. And then Gabe Davis signed with the Jaguars, was a big free agent signing for them, and is currently a free agent. So it was kind of it was kind of interesting going back and looking at that list of like top 101 free agents from last season and seeing that a lot of them got signed but haven't panned out with whatever team that was. And I just thought it was a little interesting. You know, hindsight's 2020 obviously, but they had Jalen Johnson ranked at 11 and Saquon Barkley ranked at 14 on the list that I saw. Obviously, Saquon Barkley ended up being maybe the most influential player last season. Really led that Eagles offense to a Super Bowl. Obviously, they were kind of like a defensive first team in a weird way, but to complement that defense and that ability to kind of suffocate the opponent, Saquon in the rushing game and just bleeding the clock were huge for the Eagles. So to see him ranked as low as 14 was kind of funny. And then Jalen Johnson, who I considered to be a top 5 cornerback in the NFL, ranked at the 11th best free agent available, was kind of crazy because I think he's a little more impactful in that. So just kind of a good reminder that as you see off-season lists year to year, a lot of them kind of don't hold a lot of truth heading into actual football. So yeah, hopefully we'll see Wilkins on a team soon and see him kind of return to that productive interior rusher. And then ending off here with our movie review. I'm going to call them a movie review until I actually watch something besides a movie. There's a couple shows that I might do here, but the other night watched Cedar Rapids, 2011 comedy starring Ed Helms. I thought it was really good. Kind of a stupid, late night comedy. I'd kind of put in that file of, maybe not something to watch with your mom or dad or brother or sister, but pretty funny, pretty raunchy, but kind of had a lot of heart in it. Big cast. So like I said, Ed Helms is like the main character. He's an insurance salesman who goes on this retreat, and he kind of ends up rooming with or in close confines with John C. Reilly, Anne Hesh, and Isaiah Whitlock Jr. Whitlock Jr. from The Wire fame. They had a good bit in there where he kept saying Omar quotes from The Wire, even though that's not his character, obviously, but it was pretty funny to see that. And apparently that was something that was written in before they even locked down Whitlock Jr., so kind of is a funny nod to like that whole show and his role in that. And then even kind of like the tertiary, secondary characters, Sigourney Weaver, Stephen Root, Kurtwood Smith. Really good cast all around. A lot of very funny moments. I think even Rob Corddry's in there for like a scene. But like I said, raunchy kind of comedy, but then had some really heartfelt moments. I know kind of part of the plot line is that Ed Helms' character wants to become an insurance salesman because he lost his mom and dad when he was a teenager. So he's kind of going through some like loss issues like that. He's dating Sigourney Weaver, who's like considerably older than him, and the audience kind of sees that as like a psychological, like replacing, a maternal figure kind of thing like that. And they get him to kind of grow out of that a little bit. So one of those things where there's, a lot of, really sophomore jokes, but there's still some good character development. And I thought Ed Helms, he's really good as that kind of like straight-laced, kind of like 40-year-old virgin-esque character. And then John C. Reilly is a real inappropriate, crude character that he plays so well in like Step Brothers and stuff. So kind of good to see those two nailed those kind of typecast. But then, yeah, the rest of the cast I thought was really good. So I'm going to give this a 6.5 out of 10, 6.5. Glad I watched it. Probably not a movie I'll watch again. But like I said, it's still worth the watch. I checked it out on Hulu. And I don't even think it's an hour and a half. So definitely something you can have on a weeknight or while you're doing dishes or something simple. And then heading into the weekend here, we could see some more MLB trade deadline stuff. There'll be more stuff coming out from training camp. So I'll be paying attention. And thanks for listening. We'll see you Tuesday. Peace.